Hi guys, welcome back. Today we are working on America 1828 through 1850. We are starting on slide 55. If you want to go ahead and open up your slides, go along with me. That's where we're beginning. So throughout the 19th century, economic differences between the North and the South became increasingly pronounced. These differences contributed to the tensions that eventually led to the Civil War. The Southern economies became more reliant on cotton as the centuries progressed. This highly profitable crop demanded intensive manual labor and large amounts of land. So to meet these demands, the plantation system developed, with large cotton farms that were dependent on slaves mostly because they were the cheapest labor. But in contrast, if we look at the northern economy, they were reliant on factory labor. The North, particularly the Northeast is what we're talking about right now, they became the industrial center of the nation, producing textiles and finished products for shipment throughout the U.S. and also throughout Europe. So while the South permitted slavery and directly relied on this slave labor to produce its main crop, the North benefited indirectly from the slave labor that produced the cotton that made the northern factories profitable. So the only reason the North was able to create their factories was because they could buy cheap cotton that was produced by the slaves. Since the South manufactured very few things at all on its own, most of the things that they needed were imported. So at this time, the federal government made most of its money by imposing tariffs on manufactured goods. The Northeast demanded very high tariffs because they wanted to build roads, canals, great infrastructure, but it also was affecting the market from Europe. In the southern states, they opposed these tariffs because it increased the cost of the goods that they needed to import. Northerners favored a strong federal government because they needed the government's revenue and other assistance to build these infrastructures, and the Southerners, they didn't have this need, and they feared that a strong central government would interfere with the right to hold slaves. These different attitudes towards the tariffs and the federal government, it began to create what we have sectional tensionism, or sectionalism is what we're looking at. So let's talk about sectionalism. And what is it? Slavery, it expanded considerably in the southern states. So during the early and mid-19th century, coinciding with the rise in demand, we have lots of slavery increased. Most Southerners supported slavery, yet only about 1/4 of the Southerners that were white actually even owned slaves or had slaves that belonged to slave-owning families. So beginning in the 1830s, the South became increasingly hostile towards abolition efforts, banning abolitionist pamphlets and ousting teachers suspected of participating in abolitionist movements. So throughout the early middle parts of the century, a pro-slavery movement, you need to write that down, pro-slavery, grew in the South, leading most Southern whites to identify with institutions of slavery as an important part of their culture, as well as an essential part of the economy. Southern leaders spread the idea that slavery benefited the South and that benefited their economy, and that slaves received better treatment from their masters than did most of the factory laborers from their bosses. Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina, for example, he declared slavery a positive good that would become increasingly recognized as such as long as it was allowed to continue. He said the longer it was here, the greater it would become. As the country acquired more land and more territories, requested admission to the states, sectional differences between the North and the South became increasingly apparent. And this led to a lot of tension between the two, because the more land that was being taken over, the more we had to decide, are these going to be slave states or are they going to be free states? And with each new territory, this request for statehood, Northern and Southern Congress members argued about whether to allow slavery in the new territories or not. So while Congress reached several compromises on this issue, including the Compromise of 1850, these didn't diminish the tension at all. They had a compromise, but there were still problems. The root cause you need to write down in your notes is that Southerners, even if they didn't own slaves, felt that if they didn't embrace slavery, then they would lose some kind of right. Look about these guys right here. The movement to abolish slavery in the U.S. had been gaining momentum since pretty much the Revolutionary War in 1807. Congress passed a law prohibiting the slave trade in the United States. So as a whole, the United States was saying, okay, we don't like slavery. We're going to prohibit buying more slaves, but you know what? The slaves that are already here, we'll just use them. And of course, slaves were moved in illegally as well. It took effect in 1808, but some slave trading continued, and around this time, northern states began to abolish slavery altogether. They said you can't have slavery there. There are a lot of organizations that took the lead in abolishing this slavery and this abolitionist movement that came about. One was the Society of Friends, the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, the New York Manumission Society. Many abolitionist groups grew, and they had really strong religious affiliations. The Quakers, okay, you need to write them down. They were active participants. Okay? They wanted to denounce slavery, and the advocates for it, they wanted to get rid of that. And in the 19th century, these groups successfully convinced many slaveholders, particularly in the northern parts of the South, to free their slaves. So a lot of people were letting their slaves go. You can imagine an issue now. People who were slaves, who couldn't read, couldn't write, who only knew certain jobs, being freed and put into society where people were still trying to gather more slaves. A lot of people were taken back as slaves even after they had been freed. In 1833, abolitionist newspaper publisher William Lloyd Garrison, he established the Anti-Slavery Society. So this Anti-Slavery Society was established with Minister Theodore Weld and Free African American Robert Purvis. Garrison argued that slavery violated the principles upon which the country had been founded, particularly the statement in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and have inalienable rights. So in 1841, escaped slave Frederick Douglass attended an anti-slavery society meeting in Bristol, Massachusetts, and Garrison asked him to speak. This event launched Douglass's career as the outspoken slavery opponent. Now, William Garrison and Frederick Douglass, we'll talk about them for a little bit, but they had a strange relationship. Garrison, although he wanted to free slavery, he also looked down on people who had been slaves. He looked down on them as almost lesser people with a prejudice. So you can do your own research on those two. There's a ton of information about them. The next thing you need to know is the Second Great Awakening. It increased anti-slavery sentiment. Most abolitionists, they supported other types of reform as well, not just that. They wanted women's rights, women's suffrage. They wanted to also fix the public school system. They wanted reforms in the prison. And they wanted temperance, which was the abolition or the abolishment of drinking or selling of alcohol. Now, another thing we have is the Underground Railroad. I do want you to write this down in your notes as well. It reached its peak of activity between 1810 and 1850. This network of safe houses and travel routes, okay, it was not a real railroad. Put that in your notes. This was not an actual railroad. It was the name given to the trails or the hideouts that helped slaves to escape to the north or to Canada, sometimes even to Mexico and even countries overseas. Despite its reputation as being integral to the abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad succeeded in helping only about 1,000 slaves escape each year. But still, if you think about 1,000 people who were in bondage, that's a great relief for them, their family, their children, because it wasn't just adults, it was also children. All right, Zachary Taylor. So he was born in Virginia. Zachary Taylor became a hero during the Mexican-American War. He commanded about 5,000 U.S. troops to victory over Santa Anna's 16,000 to 20,000 troops at the Battle of Buena Vista. Before this war, he had fought in several Indian wars, including the Second Seminole War of 1837. So in 1848, the Whig Party nominated Taylor as its presidential candidate, with Millard Fillmore as his running mate. They ran in 1848 in the Whig Party against Democratic candidate Lewis Cass and William O. Butler, as well as Martin Van Buren, we've heard his name before, who ran as a member of the anti-slavery Free Soil Party. Taylor won by 36 electoral votes. During Taylor's brief presidency, sectional differences over slavery in the territories became increasingly tense. Taylor asked Congress to admit California and New Mexico to the Union as states rather than as territories. He was thus hoping to avoid debate over whether two new territories should permit slavery. Southern members of Congress disapproved of this idea without an overhaul of the other slavery-related issues, and a serious debate erupted in Congress. Now we have people getting mad at each other, debating whether slavery is good or not, and this debate led to what was the Compromise of 1850. We'll talk about that some more in a couple slides. Taylor served for only 16 months of his term. He died of an illness in July of 1850, making Millard Fillmore president. So take a look at this. We're going to use this picture hopefully in class. One of you remind me to use this picture when we get to class. Compromise of 1850. So as sectionalism became more bitter, lawmakers sought solutions to this impeding crisis. Several major disputes threatened the country's unity. Should slavery be allowed in the vast new territory acquired after the Mexican-American War? Should California be allowed to enter the Union as a free state, thus upsetting this balance between free and slave states? Should Washington, D.C. continue to allow slavery? Did Texas own as much land as it claimed to extend west all the way to Santa Fe? So in 1850, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, he offered a compromise between these competing states and sectional interest. Heavily debated in Congress, the various bills of compromise became law 8 months later after Clay proposed them. The compromise's key measures included these following things. 1. Texas had to give up the western land in question, but would receive $10 million in return. So New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah territories came into being. But residents could decide they would decide their slavery status when the territories applied for statehood. So original land for Texas included New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. But Texas basically gave up that land in exchange for $10 million. Washington, D.C. would end the slave trade, but continue to allow slavery itself. So now you couldn't sell slaves at all, but not even within the states, but if you already owned slaves, you're good to go. And California would be admitted to the Union as a free state. So as a compromise of proponents of slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act would be enacted. So now we have all these compromises in 1850, and the Fugitive Slave Act also has to be signed. Because the people who own slaves said, okay, we'll add all this land, we'll change all this, but let's add this one little provision. And I think when you read through this provision, you'll see why it was so really harsh. And to me, the Fugitive Slave Act is what led us to the Civil War more than anything else. All right, the Fugitive Slave Act, made for the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850. This new law required all American citizens to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. So regardless of the slavery status of the state or the territory, those who refused could face legal penalties. The Fugitive Slave Act also made it easier for slave owners to file claims against escaped slaves and called for greater numbers of federal officials to enforce its provisions. This law also denied escaped slaves the right to trial by jury, instead mandating trial by specific commissioners who received more money for turning slaves over to the people who claimed that they owned them than for allowing them freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act ushered in an era of terror for many northern African Americans. Professional slave catchers increasingly tracked fugitive slaves throughout the North, capturing them and sending them back into slavery. Many northern blacks moved to Canada out of fear of being returned to slavery in the South, or forced into slavery even if they had never been slaves in their life. So as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act, abolitionists became more active. Slavery became an even more central issue in the national debate, and tensions between the North and the South, they began to rise dramatically. Only a little more than a decade after the Compromise of 1850, the Civil War began. Now here's your discussion questions. I want you to read through them, think about them, and we'll use these when we get back to class.